Okay, guys, well, thank you for joining me in the room. Well, guys, as you know, the conversation that's brought us here is what we've called it is when your soul walks you into a corner, which, yeah, I naturally would not have taken if I didn't think it's a very interesting subject. But I'd like to start off by talking personally, almost immediately. It has been my personal life experience in my own process, as well as nearly everybody I've worked with in the last 10 years, as well as my experience with friends and family, etc., and just basically observing through life, that the majority of people that have been profoundly challenged in this life on a mental and emotional level hold a very, very deep loneliness inside them. And a large portion of that comes from spirituality itself. So that's a really difficult comment. And what I mean by spirituality itself, I'm saying that if you were to add all the religions together and all the tribal shamanisms, and there's just like this general story that gradually gets told, and let's call it a mythology that starts falling as a blanket over certain subjects. There are certain ideas about spirituality that have changed very deeply in the last 100 years. And what I'm essentially saying is that there is no room in our modern idea of what it is to be truly spiritual for madness. There's no room for deep emotional problems. There's no room for fear and extremes of different variations of life themes. And I think that's really unfortunate, because I'm going to suggest right at the beginning of this conversation, and I'm going to end the conversation by bringing us back full 360. My favorite quote, some of you know, is that I think it's by Cummings, that we shall not cease from exploration, but at the end of all our exploring, we shall arrive where we started, but we shall know this place for the first time. So I would like to suggest that right at the beginning of this talk, that what I'm going to take us on is a little bit of a process where I'm going to try and prove to you that half of the reason we are so unhappy is because we have no context for our pain spiritually, even in spirituality. It's almost like, if I could give you now, I like to work in archetypes. And the archetype means you don't have to defend this. You don't have to take it too seriously. The archetype means this is an exaggerated version of something that you can ask yourself whether it's happening or not. And the archetype is born very much because we are in an era of mental spirituality, which, whether that's spirituality at all, is something that we can debate through the talk. But we are in an era where people that speak of being in an awakening are referring to having more information, that somehow we have equated some sort of a breakthrough to do with the fact that for the first time in our lives, or possibly in our human existence, we don't know, that we have this huge access to information, and it's a little bit easier to draw correlations about possible societal norms and necromancies. But if you're a bit confused to what I'm saying, is our idea of whatever an awakening is going on right now appears very much to be based on information, and it appears very little to do with behavior. But what I do know is that here is the archetype, here is the model. The archetype is that a spiritual person behaves in a certain way, and there is this very linear, very hierarchical kind of model that we've pulled out of our asses. I don't know where we got it from. I mean, I do know where parts of it have come from, and this is the real thing, is that you become spiritual and things get easier, essentially. And as you become more spiritual, you become more peaceful, And you can imagine this person who's now bought their yoga clothes and their martial arts suit or whatever it is that they've done, or perhaps they've now bought their garden of peace and they've changed the music they listen to. And essentially this idea is that after a while, if you're doing the right thing, this incredible peace hits you and life just becomes so much easier and you're just so much more connected to things. And like spirituality is incredible. It's just absolutely awesome. It's peaceful and makes you feel close to God. And that's the archetype, which, as you know, when I do talks, I love to talk to you about right across deep religions, original thought experiments, and to show you where ideas come from. And I can tell you, generally, we're one of the first generations that believe this bullshit. That we actually have this idea that, well, that's what spirituality is. And I want us to just consider what the danger of this is. I'm not saying that it is or it isn't. I think it's bullshit personally. But I want us to consider what the danger of this is. The danger of this is that we have many people, I'm talking in the millions worldwide, that are truly, truly made a call internally from the very vessel and the sanctities of their being, have made a call to shift or to take on something in this life that perhaps they have not been able to for many, or perhaps to take on something for their family that is running in their psychic and genetic line that perhaps no one has been able to heal for thousands of years. We really don't know. I'm not here to give you a doctrine. But what we do know is that every now and again, someone in a family has to deal with enormous pain. And our modern spiritual version of what's going on, and this is what I think is so dangerous about this, is the people I spend time with, or the people that and sometimes I can only sense it, they don't know how to explain it. There's a second archetype, and the archetype is the victim, if you could be playful, that is left in the rummage of the spiritual cookie cutter A to B enlightenment idea, which has completely lost the power of initiation, which has completely lost the narrative, the mythology, the actual cosmology. In other words, that it was inbuilt into our wisdom, that getting to points where you had to go into the darkest of possible darkest nights was part of your actual growth. And what we have is an entire generation of people, many in my age, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, that are wondering what the fuck they did wrong. Because that is the model we have. The model is, well, I know friends that claim that, you know, things got so easy and they feel connected to God. And if anything, my life has been one hellish experience or initiation. Now, this is the conversation at hand, isn't it? And these people very often leave spiritual communities. They very often keep one foot in a spiritual community, but what happens is they secretly feel that they are dirty and that they are shameful. And unfortunately, when they try and speak to people in spiritual communities about some enormity, whether it is anxieties, whether it is emotional disorders, whether it is genetic and carried over trauma, CPTSD, PTSD, absolute doubt, losing faith in absolutely everything. To me, that's one of the scariest things that's ever happened to me, having to do what I call face the abyss, where you have to fully accept that there might be absolutely nothing before your soul lets you move on. That's an incredible thing. So what I'm essentially saying is that these people that have taken on these enormous things are often left, first of all, not able to complete the initiation. And the reason is they literally die having not completed the initiation. And the reason for that is because they do not have a strong enough context and support system. Now, notice I said context, If they do not have a context strong enough for your initiation will take you out. That simple. It happens all the time. We can be romantic about it. It's not trying to distill fear in you. You are an eternal being that could come and do what you're trying to do 100 times if you wanted to. But I'm telling you now that context, and it sounds like, what the fuck does context have to do with this? That's what we're going to discuss. If we do not have the correct context for what it is we're trying to face, it very often completely takes us out. And just like we know with most trauma survivors, and now we are not just talking about trauma from this life, we're talking about trauma reaching back possibly generations. We do know in science, for instance, that you can pick up genetic trauma 7 generations just in the genes. Never mind the fact that shamans have been saying for thousands of years that your genetic line, your ancestors and you are one of a single war, one of a single victory, and one of a single initiation. So I want us to just connect, because there's a possibility that this is in your life, that you have some form of huge disappointment in yourself, or you're just not willing to really admit it. But there's a part of you that thinks, well, I'm not quite as spiritual as my other friends, because if they only knew just how crazy I really was, or if they just knew how dark the shit that goes on inside me really is. And that's the context of where we kind of climb in today. So I am very obviously suggesting that initiation is something that has been stripped from our culture. Now, naturally, there are 2 types of initiation to me. And of those 2 types, there are thousands of forms. But the first type to me would be man initiation, which I simply believe that we have begun to do because we are part of some immutable cycle that we can even within ourselves sense the birth and the death of certain cycles of destruction and of rebirth. But not just that, because it is inbuilt in our psychology, initiations. At the core of an initiation is birth and death, is beginning and ending, is the alpha and omega of cycles. So, you know, we get man-made initiations, and they tend to be from religious to tribal, or what you could call, I suppose, regarding your own sociology, but things like becoming a man, things like taking on a family, becoming a warrior, becoming a sage. These are very famous initiatory periods of a human being's life that man itself has tried to map out to help us prepare for a certain shift and change that needs to take place in our psychology for us to be able to meet the patterns that come with the new phases of our lives. So let's begin right here. If initiations were not necessary, then why is it that we have an entire generation of men that do not know how to become men? Entire generation. I'm in the middle of it. I mean, my organization's in the middle of it. I speak to people all the time. We have men in the room, and many men will tell you that, like, at no point did they actually know when they were supposed to become a man. It's just something that some of us very accidentally figure out in our 40s and 50s. Some of us. I'm dead serious. And what would becoming a man? It's not about relinquishing your understanding of fantastical things. It's just literally moving into a certain era where certain elements, which I call the rebellion wound, which is a really big part of both the female and this male psychology in adolescence, that rebellion, that wound in many cases, because women and men have not nowadays been taken into a threshold of a new era and period of their lives. We have all carried that rebellion wound over, especially spiritually. And we are seeing a whole generation of people that are aching, absolutely aching, for some deep connection that will help them through the storm of what they're experiencing, but they can't put their rebellion root down. In other words, it's like denouncing that they need to be disciplined. It's like, okay, well, that doesn't work for me exactly. You know, I get what you're saying, and it's almost like taking certain versions of spirituality and hoping that they don't apply to you and that you can just get away with all of those things. So we have this conversation of initiation, and I'm using the example of becoming an adult, of how that is not part so much of especially Western culture anymore. And it has caused a great many problems. Initiation certainly has been part of culture for as long as we know. So I am not going to go on a whole conversation about initiation, but I want to make a suggestion that's really not that hard to believe, considering that we know as above, so below, as we know what is in is without. Initiations are also something that are stimulated, invoked, transgressed, brought upon by your inner mysticism, by your own divine expression. In other words, the true initiatory phases of a human being's life are born of some process, some alchemical magic that takes place within a human being. Sure, how beautiful is that? And we know it. We actually know it. We all do, because we've all been through phases of our lives where a certain initiation or theme that has repeated right through our lives comes back into our space to see if we are ready to this time stand in the full face of the storm that is tearing at you. And most times we once again allow ourselves to be washed down in the storm and hope sometimes, as we are in the devastation of our own process, we hope that we will once again be given the absolute honor of refacing that initiation at some stage in this life. And there are small cycles of this process, and there are massive cycles of this process. And anybody who takes a keen interest in what his soul or her soul is trying to do will begin to map and begin to write and diarize. And this is why I'm such a big fan of writing daily, just a few sentences. And you will begin to notice that the same things have repeated through your entire life. Now, this is either a complete coincidence, or this is simply that you have been trying to do the same thing since the day you arrived. I can tell you that I had many cycles within myself, responsibility being one that I often avoid. I have many with addiction, but my major one, which will be the victory of my entire life, is, and it is something that for the first time in my life, I feel there is only a possibility that I might stand in its full enormity the next time it comes around. And that is madness. That is literally insanity. And so it is different for everybody. I'm just sharing with you. So there are these incredible patterns and cycles at the core of all things. This is not a belief system. This is something that anybody who sits on his porch and watches a mountain or a river or an ocean or a sunrise and a sunset, we are the midst immutable cycles, unstoppable tides that have been here since the dawn of time, and you are part of those. And within you, you have the rising and the setting of incredible processes of ornithological progress, of literally cathartic growth, wounds coming to the surface through pain. So where that leaves us is very, very interesting, is because I'm almost suggesting now that within you, according to what you think, according to what you feel, according to what you pray, and according to the way you challenge the universe, your initiations unfold. It is a gross mistake that we have made to believe that we are not sitting in the middle of the consciousness that drives all of reality. Every thought, every feeling, every prayer, every challenge, every scream is heard right from the inner center, the absolute sacred chamber of the divine is where you sit right now. And it is very often upon reading a book at some point in your life or being so moved by something that you see that a part of you begins to call. And often we call for things that we are not even aware of what it is that we are calling for. And what we are calling for is to become closer to something that is primordially driven in all of life, that thing that ache to be closer to the oneness and to the divine orgasmic expression of life. My point simply is that we often get exactly what we crave for. It just does not come the way that we expect. And suddenly initiations are upon hand. And our spiritual societies have not prepared us in any way for this fucking darkness that almost consumes us, that takes us out as spiritual beings, takes us out by the thousands daily. We fall by the thousands daily. And that is why I believe this conversation is extremely important. If it either helps you with your own initiations at hand or to come, or if it helps us through the years start a greater conversation. So what's incredible is then to ask yourself, well, just how original is this idea? And it's quite fascinating. I told you, I usually do quite a lot of history and anthropology with you guys, and I'm not going to tonight, but I really invite you to go into search into cultures, and you will discover, for instance, even Gnostic Christianity, Christianity is the thing I probably speak about least. They have the 7 stages of initiation, and they have the death, they have the resurrection, they have the benediction. I can't remember them all, but there are stages of initiation in nearly every religion that we are aware of. And this is something that you will notice in tribal communities as well, is that there are initiations of very specific points. But I want us to consider that that's still man trying his best to try and give labels to that which cannot be quantified. But it is a beautiful thing still to notice, for example, for thousands of years, we have found scrolls in vaults, like in the Essenes, and they speak about the great initiations of the true initiate, which is somebody who has decided that the only thing that is the path. And these initiations tend to be based on the major aspects of what it is that intercedes or crosses to make you as a human being. So in other words, the biggest parts of you, the aspects of you, tend to each face, according to most occult, metaphysical, and traditional, especially European, 2, 3, 4,000 years, that kind of thing tends to be very much this idea that you will at some point have to face the initiations of the mind, the altar of madness, basically the darkest thoughts and feelings, not feelings, specifically the mind, madness, and then the body itself, that there are initiations of the physical body. It's often facing death before death. It's often facing a great illness that you have to turn around, or sometimes, because that's an assumption that we know what's required, perhaps even to succumb to that thing and allow yourself to face the initiation of death, because perhaps it is not something you have done before. You have the initiations of the heart, which are even spoke about in North American culture. They talk about, I can't remember the word, I actually wrote it down for us this morning. It's called the piercing of the heart. They actually speak about the piercing of the heart. that in one of your lives, the heart will be pierced so deeply that it will be one of the most mighty things of your existence to decide what to do with that piercing. There is the will. There are the initiations of will, which tend to be around panic and anxiety, around your solar plexus disc. It tends to be around, I don't want to go too deeply into it. I just want to let you know that initiations have been written about for thousands of years. And for some reason, we're sitting in this modern culture where we can't go, wow, this woman might be facing an enormous initiation, which is literally her expanding into a deeper divine aspect of herself. And whether she's crawling it around in a room, spitting or shouting or screaming and pulling at her hair, it has absolutely nothing to do with being far away from God. And that is this very, very big subject at hand. So we are now talking about the possibility that initiation is almost self-initiated from within, from some greater aspect of you, through prayer, through what is important to you, what your values are. It is something that is self-initiated. And it is a magnificent journey that then very often gets switched on and then leaves the person thinking they've done this terrible thing wrong. And if we can recontextualize the fact that actually initiation is a huge part, if I could be quite honest, I'm trying to say that losing your shit is one of the ways to achieve everything that you actually want to achieve. Now that's quite playful, but let's see if anybody else agreed with me, right? I wrote down, because obviously I don't read I don't read off papers and things when I do a talk, but I'm actually going to pick up some papers now. I did like a little bit of a thing where I wrote down, I'm not going to read you each quote, but I'm going to give you the idea of the quote. And I wrote down people that I highly admire that have at least 4 to 10 times in a quote referred to this exact thing. The general idea of the quote would be that the only way to heaven is to descend directly into hell, that only those that know the darkest of the dark, that have been to the furthest recesses of possibility. I'll use the tree one, there are so many, but basically that your roots have to go so deep into the dark, warm earth before they can reach up right to the heavens and embrace the dancing light on the branches. I'm going to read you just a list in 25 minutes of teachers that I could think of by top of my head that spoke about this extensively. Modern day Adashanti. Adashanti speaks literally about how shame is blocking half of humanity from becoming enlightened because they think you're meant to feel good, and they don't understand that every time your soul calls you to step up, that the shit hits the fan and you start getting pulled into those dark places and you can't deal with it. The Gautama Buddha, historically, there's many stories of the Buddhas that eventually, like if you think of, or even many characters in Vedic tradition, for instance, I'm not going to go into it. I like to diverge and I mustn't. I get so fascinated by certain stories. Carl Jung, Modern People, literally spoke about how the route to heaven was through hell. Manly P. Hall, probably my greatest teacher in my life, has multiple quotes about only the person who can walk into the deepest recesses, the darkest chambers, is ready to truly hold light. He speaks about how the vices and the virtues of humanity work, that only when you can truly, for instance, face fear, can you hold love. Because otherwise your love is not safe, because as soon as you become afraid, it becomes tainted. And then therefore, to hold any of the holy grail energies, because remember, those guys are from a Masonic understanding, to hold any of the truly, I mean, they speak about it right through antiquity, but to hold the vices and the virtues, that you cannot hold the one with the other. In other words, if you want to hold a certain level of power, you have to be able to face the good and the bad of that thing, which means that to constantly expand spiritually, think about this logically. If we know it's true, in actual fact, you know, even if I said I don't usually speak about Christianity that much, nearly every saint in Christianity has basically spoken about their experiences in the dark nights of hell. Saints, and this is long after they found God. So what we're suggesting here is that once you actually begin to walk an expansive path of higher frequency, that you are therefore walking towards a time of initiation in collapsed darkness. This is not something we've been taught, and yet is highly, highly documented. So, yeah, Manly P. Hall talking about the fact that when you expand, you get stronger, but then your tests get bigger. And this is all going to be important for how we're going to bring this home in the second half, because I'm not just going to ramble about what's wrong. I'm going to make a suggestion of what it is we can do in our lives to change this, so that you may actually get done what it is you hope to get done in this life. Because I've been speaking on the subject for a month or two now. I have not actually made a suggestion on what it is I feel that we can do, or that I do in my own life. Okay, so I'll give you one more. Suri Uraban, incredible being. I read a lot of his stuff, very, very intense, but consider one of the most enlightened modern people. Same thing. He constantly talks about the fact that if you are really an initiate in the heart of God, that you have to allow the levels of unreality to be stripped back from you of what you think is good and bad, and eventually allow yourself in 100% complete surrender to, with just as an observer, eventually go into the darkness where you have to, and come out the other side eventually unmoved. Which makes perfect sense to me. I know that there is another very powerful person. I know that there's an interesting conversation with Nicholas Tesla at one stage, where he apparently equated the spiritual path to electricity, that if you were going to actually hold one sort of energy, you had to understand that it could arc onto both sides, and that you had to have that sacred neutral point in between. And that to him was what God was. It was neither the light or the dark. It was the neutrality that held the branching out of the polarities, which to me makes perfect sense. So those are just a couple of guys that I think are pretty respected, and I feel like I could have done that for another half an hour, but that are basically trying to say to people, there is no beautiful, smooth path. You decide that you want to come here and you want to do something absolutely profound, well, then shit is going to get so dark that there's a good chance with our modern model of spirituality that you might not even like spiritual people, or you might find it difficult to understand this model that they're trying to force on us. Or even worse, we believe this modern bullshit, and we become so isolated that we secretly believe we're the only one who can't figure it out, when there is a very good chance that that darkness that you carry is the mastery of thousands of years of work. And if you can just focus in this conversation, there might be a key for you in unlocking that. Not because of me. I am simply having a conversation with you about a subject that we do not wish to speak about. But I am suggesting that your madness and that your pain and your addictions and your trauma and your chaos and your might be culminating now to a point where literally, as this great hero's journey we speak of so often, where the hero is called to descend into the darkness, to return with the gifts that comes with facing whatever he faces in the underbelly. And that is the possibility that we are speaking of at this time. So these people spoke about this for a very, very, I mean, it's very, very documented, but how is it? We need to take a little bit of an acknowledgement here. How is it that spirituality has become a very mind-based, egoic construct that is hurting us? I myself, if I had to identify my own spiritual ego at work, the reason why my last talk I did was on the spiritual ego was because I feel like we've allowed spirituality to turn into a monster personally. And An example would be that if someone started having a panic attack, an anxiety attack, drank themselves into a stupor, lost their minds for periods of time, the last thing that goes through your mind is, wow, I wonder what that guy's facing for the overall divine expression or for humanity itself. It's the last thing you think. The first thing that goes through your mind is, this guy's lost, he's clueless, he doesn't know God, he needs Jesus, he needs Allah, he needs whatever it is. We never think to ourselves, oh my goodness, he's in the midst of a spiritual war. And that is how our love is actually hijacked by the spiritual ego, so that even people trying to be in our presence with this kind of initiation and pain, that we even ostracize them by telling them that they're doing something wrong or they've got lost somewhere along the way. And we actually have absolutely fucking no way of knowing that that's true. In actual fact, it can only be born of the mind. It is absolute arrogance to tell someone in the thrives of insanity that they have done something wrong. There is absolutely no way of knowing that. So that takes us towards a very interesting conversation now. Is the conversation, what it becomes is, if this is something that is inbuilt to the divine aspect of reality, we as a being, you know, there are some incredible stories in Arabic culture about how humanity itself unconsciously takes turns to send in someone right into our unconscious, to expand us, to deepen our roots, so that we may reach even higher as a overall nation. And I think that's an incredible story, because when we consider our own pain, we consider it very separate to other people. And very often what you notice is that in tribes, back in the day, I say, because nowadays we don't have very small communities, it is proven in many theses so I say theses, people that write about this type of stuff, that it was a lot easier to hold our problems within a small community that had a context for it. They were able to actually understand the role that your pain or your proclivity or your specific problem played in society. So where that leaves us is with this idea. I am therefore suggesting that if you do everything right and you learn to increase your frequency and you learn to understand that the body can expand, that you can make better choices, and that you can have a greater understanding of how all things connect to one another, that you very often then call in an initiation. And that initiation will be the complete opposite experience. It will be a sacred state of aloneness. I want you to consider that when your energy field is in a very high frequency, which is what we find very acceptable in modern spirituality, we don't shame it. That's where we think all the good stuff happens. So we're like, oh, come in. He's got such a high frequency. So nice to be around. I want you to consider that when you're in that expanded state, that your membrane of your aura to how you connect to things is almost semi-permeable. In other words, like, it's not hard to believe that you're part of the mountain. It's not hard to feel that you're connected to the person that you're talking to. The problem with that kind of state is that it becomes very, very difficult to take responsibility for the exact thing that you are thinking, feeling, and bringing into the world, because you are very much in a I'm one with everything kind of state. So I want you to consider how the opposite, which is what I call the sacred states of aloneness, when your energy field begins to close down, not collapse, almost seal like a hard auric egg, and the frequency of the egg begins to change. For those of you who can see auras know what I mean. And the frequency of the egg starts to change. And what essentially happens is the temple doors of your own temple close on you. And what you are suddenly left with is your inner universe, but not so much with the way that it is, what would the right word be, interacting with the outside universe. In other words, you suddenly feel frightfully alone in many ways. Or An example of this would be there are thought patterns that you are not being aware of, and suddenly they will become so in your face. There might be emotional disorders that you usually don't give a lot of attention to. And when you shut down into that sacred state of aloneness, it's almost as though your soul is forcing you to have a critical look at how you are creating from the absolute eternal essence of your being. It's very hard to explain, but I think that the most important thing is that we've all experienced it. We all know what it feels like when we're expanding and everything just feels so incredible. My pain makes so much sense. I look back into reality. I look into the things I've had, the relationships I've had. It all makes sense. Look at this person I'm becoming. My God, it makes so much sense. And then I make a breakthrough and I feel incredible for weeks. And I'm thinking big things, like spiritually, I'm really motivated. I'm feeling a whole new dedication to some divine expression or God. And suddenly this next collapse state comes. And I want us to consider that almost like walking to an airport door, wanting to take a flight higher than you've ever been before, that every time you try and go through that airport door, that there's something there, being yourself, that goes, sorry, you can't come through the door, you've got too much density in you. So we go into a sacred state of aloneness. In other words, we activate an initiation. And it is hopefully through that initiation that we are able to clear those things that are stopping us from expanding into even higher states of frequency. So I want us to therefore acknowledge that this in-breath and this out-breath, which is at the very core of Vedic stories, is literally how creation was made, that everything is breathed out and everything is breathed in, and that is on a cosmic scale, Brahma over trillions of years. But I want us to consider just for ourselves as well, that this in-breath and out-breath is something that we can connect to. Now, we already know what happens to most of us on the in-breath is we start to realize suddenly we're trapped with our thoughts, we're trapped with our feelings, we feel less connected to the world around us and to nature. And we go into fucking panic mode. And we do things that we really wish we hadn't done. And it doesn't matter. It could be fighting with people. It could be becoming so unhealthy. You will have a completely different way of eating during that time. And of course, this could be from the most subtle initiation to some of you have had initiations where you wondered if you would make it out at all. And I'm not really getting into which that is. And I want us to just consider once again, it's because we do not have a context for what it is that we're experiencing. And never mind the shame and the guilt and all that crap that comes along with it, because we believe that we have done something wrong. And I want you to please understand that I am not suggesting that every time you go into a sacred state of aloneness, that it's got to do with secrecy. You could have just gone on a cocaine bender. I mean, that will do the same thing. That will get you so locked into your own auric egg that when you eventually start softening that auric egg a few weeks later, you would have almost been driven mad by your own shit bouncing around in there. It's the same process. It's not a judgmental process. It's frequency. You can do the same thing with alcohol. You drink enough alcohol, and you will notice eventually that you're in a point where you don't feel connected to anything, and that you are now stuck in a very dense, almost mucus-like auric egg, and it takes you weeks to open the thing up. God, it takes apples and jogs and all of this, and eventually you're like, oh God. And I'm dead serious about what I'm sharing. It's very important that we take responsibility for the fact that our auric egg is opening and closing naturally, but that we can affect it highly as well, but that it's the same experience. The experience is of, I want you to imagine, usually your temple doors and windows are wide open. And I want you to imagine now the outside world blows in and people talk to you and you can feel things and you can smell things. And when we go into these initiations, which sometimes, as I said, are not initiations, they are us quite literally having got to a point where we actually bring these traumas down onto ourselves, but then the temple doors close. What does it feel like inside there? Whether it's because you've had a hangover or you've done a lot of drugs or because you made terrible decisions and you did things that you're regretting so badly now that you are in almost, if you could call it, stuck in a temple of resolution where you can't stop thinking about those things, where they're dominating you. I want you to just consider that what this state is a state of responsibility. It's a state to get to look at what it is that you are thinking, what it is you are feeling. But I also want you to remember that the divine aspect is inside that temple with you when those doors close. So where does that leave us? I mean, it's quite an enormous conversation. Where it leaves me really is if we had a context for why it is we go through initiation, if we had a context to prepare people for it, and it was inbuilt in our mythology, which it has been for many, many other cultures, I think that we would, first of all, be far more loving and accepting towards it. And I think we'd be far more prepared with how to deal with other people. If we realize what initiation is, I want you to meditate on this one day. You will notice that if you are willing to accept the enormity of the initiations that are possible in your life, you will lose your opinion about nearly everything you see around you. It's a mindfuck of note. Because once you realize that even Jesus himself screamed out from the cross, "Why have you forsaken me?" then I want you to just consider, I mean, the guys, we've been using Christianity a lot tonight, so, but I mean, just looking Christianity, I mean, they very clearly demarcate that Jesus had to go somewhere very specific where he felt safe to try and pray. And whether it's physically true or not, they try and express that he bled. He actually bled his pain. Like, that's what, you know, in the story that we talk about the stages of initiation, where he felt completely left alone. His egg closed so alone that he screamed out, "Why have you forsaken me?" And then, as we've discussed before, the next verse was the shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus wept. So only bringing it up because I could go into a lot of religions and they speak about just how bad it can actually get. Why are we not speaking about this? Why are we pushing people's ships off onto an ocean? In other words, inspiring them to go onto the spiritual path. And it's almost, I feel like it's sadistic, not preparing them for the true realities of what is required. And it's not all doom and gloom, it's absolutely beautiful. So to me, like in our community, for instance, that's why we are such avid perpetuators and lovers towards holding space. And I want to try and explain to you why as like our closing 15 minutes. So to me, right, whatever your initiation in your life might be panic attacks, it might be that every time I'll give you a few examples, like at a certain point in your life, maybe you've been single and every time you get to a certain point, you get so lonely that you get yourself back into a relationship. There are so many cycles, and I want you to know how many are playing out. It could be that you're an alcoholic, and every time you get to your second day with no alcohol, things get so bad that you feel like the hordes of fucking hell themselves start to tear at your flesh and you can't get through it. It could be that you have psychological problems and you use certain medications. And every time you try and come off those medications, things get so bad that it just gets to the point where you actually don't know if you will ever get through it. It could be emotions. It could be a lot of things. It could be traumatic feelings that you're too scared to feel. And I want us to consider that what is actually required is some form of holding space, but some form of chamber Now, this is something we've known for a very long time because we created churches and we created, but I want you to consider in your own life that if you really want to take on your own initiations, you need to create a war room. You need to create a spiritual war room. And that spiritual war room, just depending on just how deep and dark this lifetime of tests that you've chosen has gotten, I can tell you now, I will share with you that I go into psychosis. And when I go into psychosis, I get so scared that most of my life I would go and drink anything I could get my hands on. I cannot for the life of me, I hope you never experience it in all your life, what it is to like to go into psychological psychosis. But I can tell you that I used to get so scared in that state that I would do absolutely anything. Now, nowadays, I have a war room. And what that means is I have a room that's prepared for me. And that room can involve quotes that you want to remember, written by you or other people. It can involve talisman. It can involve religious figures or icons. It can involve pictures. It can involve, but things that you basically create like a shrine to help you, not because you think you have to, or not because someone's told you, because you make a decision tonight that you've realized that there is a major initiation in your life that you always run from because you don't know what to do when it comes. Prayer came about not accidentally into man. I can promise you that for thousands of years, man instinctively has found himself falling to his knees, unsure of what to do. So my advice to you would be to create whatever you want to call it, a sanctuary or a safe space for yourself, where if ever, and guys, you know what I like to believe? I like to believe that your soul will give you initiations and they will increase only if you're able to face them. And an example would be, let's say that every time you hit a certain point of absolute anxiety or even rage, maybe you have a rage problem, and usually now you'd be screaming at everybody in your family, or anxiety, we're all different people. And if you could go to that space, and when that thing comes up, go to your hands and knees and literally work through it in whatever way you feel that you need to. Because we already know, if we look back at our lives in hindsight, which tests we passed and which we haven't. It's incredible that we know that. If we look back in our lives, we already know which things that we have transcended have brought great wisdom and great quality to our lives. Now, I personally have won many initiations and many battles, but I can also tell you that I have been a coward more times than you could believe. I know that I have been the destructor, the betrayer, the darkness. I have been all those things more times than I count to believe. And I also know that there are certain initiations that are going to return into my life. And I intend to fucking be ready this time. And I know that what that creates, or what that means, is a few things. Is I need someone that can stand in that ground with me. That's the most important thing for me. When I go into that insanity, there is nothing like having someone that you, because you know, guys, even if you work with people with panic attacks and things, do you know, half the time they're terrified to go out. They say it's because they don't want to have a panic attack on their airplane, and they say it's because they don't want to have a panic attack at the car. Or the truth is that actually there's a huge part of us that is absolutely terrified of, if we become unhinged, how other people will cope with us or relate to us. That is 99% of the psychological problems when it comes to initiations. So if you can develop a person or a family or a community that you truly believe, whether you are so deep in psychosis that you're flinging your own fucking feces across the room, that you trusted them to hold that space for you, 99% of your unconscious pressure regarding those things disappears. So sometimes it's just a case of having a conversation like this, and when you feel really big emotions, start to go into that space and hold that space for yourself and allow yourself to see what's on the other side of it. But the extremes of this, which is where my work lies, the majority of my work lies, is with people that literally are so deep in trauma that every time this hits, they'll go and inebriate themselves or whatever it is. It doesn't matter what it is that they do, there's something that they cannot stand in the enormity of. And we create a space where they believe that they are able to face that thing. And that is what initiation is. And it's an incredible, absolutely incredible thing. But it's unique to each person. And each person has a very good idea of what it is that keeps repeating in their lives, that is taking them out. And sadly, usually we lose quite a few of our first initiations regarding a subject, and we forget that we are getting stronger. And almost like the elephant that's held down by the little peg in the ground, we sometimes, by the time we are in our 40s, 50s, and 60s, have already got to the point that we have forgot to revisit the war. It's almost like we've accepted that the victory is no longer at hand. The most extreme version of this would be, for instance, if I can give you, because I like to work in archetypes, I'm now working with quite a lot of people that have psychosis. And an example is, for instance, this is how. When a person goes into psychosis, they become so absolutely terrified that there's almost no way to dissipate the fear that they go into. So an example is, we teach them how to move into animalistic sounds, or to connect to a primal aspect of themselves, which gives them something to do, because they become absolutely trapped. And what happens is then also creating a chamber for this person with the images and whatever it is that makes this person safe. And this person might even crawl around or bash around in the room. And when they hit that most scary point, they sometimes move into the animalistic sounds, something that they're invoking on purpose as a strategy to face the darkest seconds of their lives, which has repeated for them many times. This technique, which I'm being very vague of, I have actually watched take people with psychological problems that are shattered even into forms of schizophrenia. I have watched them reclaim their minds once they realize, when that thing comes where they usually start screaming and freaking out, once they have that tool of, for instance, and then they switch into that animalistic state, which is not something I've come up with. I got this all from shamanism, because if you watch a person so fucking deep inside an ayahuasca ceremony, like where they decide to go super, super deep, there is a point where they switch over to an animal. And I've watched this for 10 years. And I eventually asked myself, as someone who suffers from psychosis, what role this could play in helping me. And I now, when I begin to lose touch with reality, often find myself crawling on the floor and using those animalistic sounds instead of feeling that terror that I get stuck into. I found myself actually feeling quite empowered. I have discussed with some people that just have panic attacks that even now go into them. Like, I've got a friend that goes into his office bathroom when his panic attacks are rising, and even though he doesn't have quite the extent of what I do, he goes into the office, and as he locks the door, he goes in there going, and what's going on in his mind is almost the animal takes over, and the animal says to the mind stories, because it's always the mind, is this the fucking best you got? So you need to sometimes isolate yourself into this thing, whether it's a loneliness or a fear, or I'm talking about a massive subject that's very hard to personalize. I can only do it one-on-one for people, but I thought I would give you the absolute extremes of how this would look. You give person the context. Do you know how different a person's context is when they believe that that thing happening in their mind is simply because there's something wrong with them? Do you know how fucking scared they get? Do you know, if you just spend 2 months with that person explaining initiations to them, and that they may be facing the initiations of the mind, or maybe it's an emotional disorder, do you know that if you build a context as a facilitator or as a healer or as a guide or whatever it is you are, a counselor, do you know that that person changes their whole lives by now waiting for the next time the enormity of this thing is going to happen, so that they can see if they can face and come out with a victory? And you give them a few tools. Like I said, in the case of psychosis, we use animalism. That's how desperate that state is. They learn to repossess their own fucking minds through bringing in their primal intelligence of animals. So yes, my closing thoughts for you guys are regarding initiations, regarding what it is that we each need to do to completely empower a true path for ourselves. In other words, what humanity is lacking is, I've got quite a strange statement for you. It is quite an accepted fact that we do not control our minds. And it's quite an accepted fact that we are mentally immature. And I personally do not agree whatsoever. In actual fact, I think that we are almost grossly mental. I would go as far as to say that we are possessed by thought. We have many, many faculties to us, and thought is only one of them. I want us to consider that for a few hundred years, as science has kind of grown, we've got to this point where we've given a lot of credence to that kind of intelligence, to try to give things labels, even things that are actually intangible, and to trying to understand the world in a very three-dimensional way, which is understandable. But I want us to consider that what's really required, and if you're really battling with your path, a lot of the people that I work with, they read a lot of books about disassociation of thoughts, like Eckhart Tolle, and I understand that. I want to make a suggestion to you. The problem is not our minds. The problem is our emotions. We are emotionally immature, way beyond belief as a culture. Okay, so now that sounds like a strange statement, but when you create this chamber and you go sit and do your prayer, or you do your meditation or whatever, which is not, as we've established, always going to be so peaceful. Sometimes it's time for war. I am literally suggesting that the greatest thing you can do to alter your life is to begin to discipline your emotions. Discipline. I know it sounds ridiculous, because I'm not going to spend another half an hour talking about how, because I have on many talks, how important it is to let your fears and your anxiety speak, to invite them back into your life. But I'm talking about the disciplining of the emotion. Things that we are convinced are real, like ADHD, which obviously is real, otherwise people wouldn't have it. But what I'm saying is, the majority of the problem with things like ADHD, with things like mental disorders, things like schizophrenia, etc., is not the problem of the mind. It's the problem of the emotions that are running unchecked behind it. I call it the monkey heart. Let me give you an example. What difference does it make if you think, I might die just now? It's just a thought. The only reason you'd get absolutely terrified and out of your head is if the thought kept stimulating a certain feeling, yes or no? Think about this. But like, really think about this. Someone who is terrified of death, and you're like, oh, they've got to get control of their mind. They're terrified of death. They're not. They are terrified of the feeling that thinking about death brings up. We are emotionally immature. We have not been taught how to sit in the fucking fiery furnace of our own soul distortions when they push and pull. And therefore, we are so immature that when the enormities of these spiritual feelings and emotional feelings that have been tearing at us for thousands of years, that have made us what we are as a society, we have become so silly and washed up that we literally don't realize that something powerful is happening. So I want to give more examples, right? A person who has ADHD, what is going on with the majority of them is that they have micro traumas or traumas of emotions that are inside them that are pulling for the attention all the time. So the second that they calm down, there's some sort of a physical reaction within them that gets them to then look. There's nothing wrong with a person's mind who has ADHD. They've got to go south. They've got to look emotionally. People with psychological problems, they are not afraid of the thought. They are afraid of the emotion that it invokes. Do an experiment on yourself. Think about like, oh, my mind, I'm so anxious. there's something wrong with my mind. I think scary thoughts. No, there's nothing wrong with your mind. You think scary thoughts, and then this huge emotion starts. And you're so scared of that emotion that now you can't stop thinking that scary thought. There's nothing wrong with your mind. Your mind's not stupid. It goes, oh, I really don't want to be anxious. I really don't want to be anxious. Well, I mean, it knows exactly what makes you anxious, right? So I want us to consider that the breakthrough for you is to realize that spirituality is not in your head, that we've been absolutely tricked by this modern era of the brain has taken this whole thing over. If you want to shift, if you want to become powerful in your own life, put the mental books down. This has been going on since the 80s. We are a society of hundreds of years ahead of our emotions. I want you to consider if you could, within 5 years, sit in a room and the biggest fucking panic attack of your life, or the most existential dread you've ever felt, or loneliness that's so big that your shoulders are sobbing, I want you to consider that in 5 years' time, if you could sit within that state and go, is this the strongest it gets? How your life would change. Do you think you'd have a problem with your mind? There's nothing wrong with your mind. Your mind stimulates ideas that every now and again trigger an emotion. And this is really important, because what would this look like? Well, what this would look like would be creating a room where you feel safe, filled with things that make you feel powerful, religious icons, whatever it is, like Buddhas, whatever it is for you, a cross, whatever it is for you. And I want you to consider that your initiatory war room. And I want you to consider that every single one of you have 1 or 2 emotions, or 3, that your breakthrough lies on the other side of that emotion. For the majority of people, it is an aspect of fear. For me, it is definitely fear. And I want you to consider that every time that feeling starts to grow inside you, the things that we go and do and unconsciously behave, and that if you could create a space where only when it suits you, because sometimes life is busy, you go and sit in that space and you say, all right, let me feel the enormity of this thing. And I want you to be in question when you are so afraid of trying to control your mind. I want you to ask yourself, would you be that afraid of what your mind thought if you were not afraid of the feelings that it invoked? What difference does it make if I sit and consider like looking out of the ocean that maybe, I don't know, maybe there is nothing else? Well, it's really not that important. There's nothing disturbing about it until emotion kicks in. And when emotion kicks in and starts scaring me, then, oh my God, I'm so scared. I thought that, I wish I hadn't thought that. We are not sick in our heads. We literally are sick in our emotions. We are immature in that area. And if we want to become powerful, we must say no feeling is too strong. And you will, if you begin to investigate, you will find history littered with sages and saints that in their prayers begged, absolutely begged, when the full enormity of the thing that their soul felt they needed to face came upon them. And my closing statement to you is, you will not truly understand surrender until you understand that surrender does not mean that you feel safe and you trust God. Surrender is to get to the point where you so truly know that your mind cannot solve the problem, that you close your eyes and you say, I let go because I have to. I let go because I can. And I'll see where it is that I land. And it's an incredible feeling, because most saints and most great writers will tell you that once you have, in the darkest moments of your life, not run away and fallen into that darkness and literally just being like, I cannot solve this. I hand this over to a greater part of me, and to feel the soft leaves that catch them the next morning as the new light of who they are after the initiation begins to hit their face in the morning. They begin to glimpse the in and out breath process that has actually been calling all along, that has been working in your life all along, but that we have not become present to, and that mostly we have fought, we have tried to block and mostly have thought that something is terribly wrong. Shush.